Jerome Wilson, a name that resonates in the world of luxury hospitality, had built his empire from the ground up. A self-made man, he wasn't just any CEO. He was the visionary behind a chain of five-star hotels that promised not just a stay, but an unforgettable experience. His hotels weren't just places to sleep. They were destinations where every guest felt like royalty. But even the most successful empires face challenges, and recently, there had been whispers of discontent. Complaints were rolling in, steady as the tide, each pointing at one hotel in particular. One where guests felt they were being treated as second-class citizens. Jerome knew that in a world where reputation could be made or broken by a single guest's experience, it wasn't enough to simply hear about these complaints. He had to witness it for himself. The idea of his hotel being anything less than perfect unsettled him. He had poured his heart, soul, and every ounce of energy into creating a space where luxury met comfort, where no detail was overlooked. This wasn't just a business for him. It was his legacy. So, Jerome decided to take matters into his own hands. He would visit this hotel unannounced, not as the powerful CEO, not as the man who had designed its very foundation, but as just another guest blending in with the crowd. With a simple reservation and no entourage to announce his arrival, Jerome set off to see the service firsthand. He wanted to see if the complaints were a fluke or if something deeper was festering within the walls of his establishment. He was prepared to be just another face in the crowd, hoping that the quality of service would stand on its own, untouched by the power of his name. But what he experienced when he arrived at the front desk wasn't just disappointing. It was infuriating. What was meant to be a world-class welcome, a true representation of the luxury he had promised, was instead a cold, dismissive encounter that would change everything. As Jerome stood there, waiting to be acknowledged, little did the receptionist know that the man she so casually ignored was the very person who owned the empire they worked for. His decision to remain incognito, to not show the world who he truly was, would soon reveal the cracks in the system and expose the culture of complacency that had taken root. What would happen next was not just about poor customer service. It was about exposing a broken system and taking back control. Jerome's story was about to unfold in a way no one could have predicted, and the repercussions of this single visit would echo throughout the entire empire. Jerome stepped into the lobby of the hotel, his footsteps echoing against the polished marble floors. The grandeur of the space, the soft glow of the chandeliers, and the air of elegance were all things he had designed with his own hands. Yet none of that mattered in this moment. It was all suddenly reduced to a cold, heartless room where he, the very person who had built this empire, was treated as though he didn't even exist. The receptionist, Kim, barely glanced up from her phone when he approached the front desk. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, her fingers tapping away with the kind of rhythm that spoke volumes. She was completely disinterested in anything happening around her. Jerome cleared his throat, trying to make his presence known. But Kim didn't flinch. Not a single muscle in her face twitched. Her indifference was suffocating, and for the first time in his life, Jerome felt like a ghost in his own hotel. He took a deep breath, reminding himself that he was there to observe, to understand, not to react. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I have a reservation under the name Jerome Wilson." Kim let out a dramatic sigh, a sound that cut through the silence like a blade. It was a sound that screamed, "I don't get paid enough to care about this." She lazily shifted her gaze upward, barely acknowledging him. Her eyes flickered to his face for a fraction of a second, before drifting back to the phone in her hand. She was in no rush to help, as if he were a nuisance. An interruption in her own little world. Jerome's patience was wearing thin, but he didn't let it show. He tried again. "I have my reservation here," he said, pulling out his phone and showing her the confirmation email. But Kim only shrugged dismissively, her gaze barely lifting from the screen. "Yeah, sure. I'll check it." Her fingers moved sluggishly over the keyboard, tapping at the keys with no sense of urgency. Jerome could feel the tension building in his chest. He knew what was happening. It wasn't a mistake, it wasn't an error in the system. This was personal. She had already decided, without even looking at him, that he wasn't worth her time. She didn't know him, didn't care to know him, and that, to her, was all that mattered. "Are you sure about that?" Jerome asked, his voice steady but with a hint of something darker beneath the surface. Kim didn't answer. She simply nodded, her eyes still glued to the phone in her hand. "Yeah, sure. I'm sure," she muttered, and then, without looking up, she went back to scrolling through her phone like he wasn't even there. Jerome stood there, his hand still holding the phone, the reservation email now clearly visible. He felt a wave of disbelief washing over him. He had spent years building this empire, pouring his soul into every detail, every guest experience. And here he was, standing in the lobby of one of his most luxurious hotels, being treated like an unwanted guest, like a nobody. "Could you please check again?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled now, but a small edge creeping into his tone. He refused to back down. Kim's response was the same. A heavy sigh, a roll of her eyes, and the most dismissive wave of her hand. "Nope, not there." Jerome's pulse quickened. This wasn't just bad service. This was a direct insult. She wasn't even pretending to care. His reservation was nowhere to be found, and it wasn't because it didn't exist. It was because she had chosen, in that instant, to ignore him, to make him invisible. She had made a decision in the span of 5 seconds. He didn't belong here. That he stood motionless, absorbing the sting of the moment. He could have left, walked out of the lobby, and never returned. He could have let it go, just another one of those everyday failures of service that happen in any business. But he couldn't. Not now. Not when it was happening right under his nose. Jerome reached into his pocket, pulling out a second phone, the one with full access to the internal system. He tapped in his credentials without a second thought, a cold determination in his eyes. It only took seconds before the system confirmed what he already suspected. There it was, his reservation, manually deleted. Not a glitch, not a system error. Kim had erased it. He felt a mix of shock and anger bubble up inside him, but he kept his expression neutral. Slowly, deliberately, he looked up at Kim, who was still glued to her phone. "Kim," he said, his voice calm but the weight of the situation starting to press on her. Kim's eyes flickered to him, but there was no fear in her gaze. She was too arrogant, too comfortable in her own position to be intimidated. Yet Jerome's fingers tapped the screen of his phone. "Tell me something, Kim," he asked, his voice now lower, more controlled. "What happens when you delete a reservation?" Kim froze, her fingers faltering on her phone, but she recovered quickly. "It just removes it from the system," she replied dismissively. As if this was a normal, everyday task, Jerome's gaze narrowed. "Who has the ability to do that?" "Only front desk staff," Kim answered, her voice losing its confidence. She didn't know it yet, but the game was over. Jerome tapped the screen one last time, turning his phone so she could see it clearly. Her eyes widened as the name on the deletion log registered. It was hers. Kim's face drained of color, and for the first time that night, she looked nervous. Her hands trembled as she tried to compose herself. But the truth was out now. "Why did you delete my reservation?" Jerome asked, his voice quiet but dangerous. Kim opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The words she wanted to say were locked in her throat, the weight of her actions now suffocating her. Jerome knew the answer before she could speak. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake. This was a deliberate act of disdain. Jerome wasn't just another guest to her. He wasn't worth the effort, the respect, or the simple act of providing the service she was paid to deliver. And in that moment, everything changed. Jerome's heart raced as he held his phone steady in his hand. He stared at the screen, the confirmation email still open, his reservation clearly visible. His fingers tapped the keys with purpose as he accessed the hotel's internal system, the one he had access to as the CEO. The cool blue glow of the phone illuminated his face, reflecting his determination. He had been patient, too patient, but this was no mistake. This was something deeper, and he knew it as his credentials loaded into the system. He felt the weight of the situation settle over him like a thick fog. He knew what he was about to find. But even so, when the confirmation popped up on the screen, a timestamp, a reservation ID, everything in order, his pulse quickened. He scrolled down, narrowing his eyes at the activity log. There it was. His reservation had been deleted. Not by the system, not by a malfunction. It had been manually erased. By Kim. Jerome's fingers tightened around the phone. It was almost like the walls of the hotel had closed in around him. His empire, his creation, was being undermined by the very people who were supposed to uphold its standards. For a moment, he didn't know whether to laugh or scream. This wasn't just a bad day, this wasn't just poor service. This was an attack. An intentional attempt to dismiss him, to make him feel like he didn't belong in his own hotel. And worse, it was being done by an employee who had no idea who he truly was. He took a steadying breath, making sure his voice remained calm as he raised his gaze to Kim, who was still standing there, obliviously fiddling with her phone. "Kim," he said softly, but with authority. She didn't look up. She was too busy, too distracted, too uninterested in her job to care. "Kim," he repeated, his voice a little firmer now. She sighed loudly, eyes flickering toward him for just a second. It was clear she still didn't recognize the seriousness of the situation. Jerome stood, his posture straightening, his resolve hardening. He wasn't just going to let this slide. Not now. Not when it was clear that this wasn't some innocent mistake. He couldn't ignore the way she had dismissed him, not once, but repeatedly, so casually, so coldly, like he was beneath her. "I have something to show you," he said, his voice calm, but edged with something deeper. He pulled out his second phone, the one that gave him access to the hotel's internal systems. He tapped it in her direction, the screen lighting up in her face. Her eyes fell on it for the first time, and for the first time all night, Kim's composure wavered. She glanced nervously at the screen. "What's this?" she asked, feigning indifference, but the slight tremor in her voice betrayed her. Jerome didn't respond right away. Instead, he let the silence hang between them for a moment. Long enough for her to feel the tension, long enough for her to realize that something was very wrong. He tapped his fingers on the phone again, bringing up the logs with the unmistakable timestamp, the exact time and date when his reservation had been erased from the system. "There it is," Jerome said, his voice barely above a whisper, but it landed like a blow. "This is the activity log, Kim. You deleted my reservation." Her face froze. Her fingers, which had been nervously scrolling on her phone just moments ago, stopped moving. She didn't speak at first. She didn't even blink. But Jerome could see the color draining from her face as she realized she was caught. Kim swallowed. her mouth opening and closing as if she were trying to formulate a defense, but nothing came out. She could barely meet his gaze now. It was as though the weight of the truth had knocked the wind out of her. "Well," Jerome pressed, "why did you delete my reservation, Kim?" Her eyes darted around the room, avoiding his gaze. She took a step back, as if she could somehow escape the truth that was right in front of her. I didn't delete it. It must have been a system error or something. It's not my fault," she stammered, her voice a little too high-pitched, too frantic to be believable. Jerome could see through the lie, see how she was scrambling to cover up her mistake. The system didn't glitch. People did. And Kim had made her choice. She had seen him standing there, waiting to be acknowledged, and decided that he wasn't worth her time. She had decided that he didn't belong. He leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. "Don't lie, Kim," he said, his tone icy. "I have access to the system. I know exactly what happened. And I know you deleted my reservation." Kim's face paled further. She opened her mouth again, but her voice caught in her throat. She was shaking now, her fingers twitching, her eyes flicking nervously to the screen, trying to find some way out, some way to undo the mistake she had made. But there was no back button for this. There was no easy way out. Jerome's gaze never wavered. He had seen this before, but never so blatantly. This wasn't a case of a simple oversight. This was a choice, a decision to disregard a guest, to treat him like he didn't matter. And it wasn't just about poor service, it was about disrespect. It was about her treating him like he wasn't worth her time, like he didn't belong in the hotel he had built. "You think I don't know what's going on here?" he asked, his voice quiet but filled with an undeniable power. "This is your decision, Kim. You've been doing this for a while, haven't you? Taking guests' reservations and pretending they don't matter." Kim remained silent, her eyes glued to the floor, unable to meet his gaze any longer. Jerome wasn't done. "You've been here for years, haven't you? And all this time you've been getting away with it. Ignoring complaints, treating guests like trash, and no one did anything about it." He paused, letting that sink in. "Well, Kim, that changes today." Jerome stood still, his gaze fixed on Kim, who was now visibly trembling in front of him. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on the both of them. The silence between them was thick with tension, but this was just the beginning. He wasn't about to let her escape. Not when he knew this wasn't just a mistake. It was a pattern that had been ignored for far too long. With a steady hand, he unlocked his phone and started scrolling through the internal system. He knew the hotel's records would reveal what he needed to know. As the CEO, he had access to everything, and right now he was going to dig deep. He wasn't just going to confront Kim. He was going to expose the root of the problem, the failure that had allowed her behavior to continue unchecked for so long. He pulled up the guest complaint logs, one after another, each one telling a story of disrespect, unprofessionalism, and outright malice. The names blurred together, but the recurring theme was unmistakable. Kim's name appeared on nearly every page. Every single guest who had encountered her had complained. And the complaints weren't about minor inconveniences. They were about far more serious issues. Jerome's heart tightened as he read through the reports. Kim wasn't just a bad employee. She was a toxic presence in the hotel. Guests had described her as rude, dismissive, and at times, downright hostile. She ignored requests, gave incorrect information, and even refused to help guests with legitimate concerns. But it wasn't just poor service, it was something darker. Something far more insidious. One report caught his eye. A guest had written about how Kim had mocked their accent, imitating them in a way that was both cruel and belittling. Another described how she had rolled her eyes at a group of Asian tourists who had asked for directions, refusing to offer any assistance. A third complaint was even more disturbing. A guest who had witnessed Kim making a racist comment to a colleague about a black family staying at the hotel. Jerome's stomach twisted. He had built this empire on the foundation of respect, dignity, and excellence. And here was someone, a member of his staff, who was not only failing to meet the most basic standards of hospitality, but was actively engaging in behavior that went against everything he believed in. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't ignore it. Not when it was happening right under his nose, in a hotel he had poured his soul into. His finger hovered over the next complaint, his eyes scanning the words with increasing disbelief. Kim had been involved in multiple disputes, each time dismissing guests' concerns without resolution. It wasn't just one or two incidents. It was a pattern that had been allowed to fester for months, maybe even years. He felt a surge of anger rising within him, but he forced himself to stay calm. The problem wasn't just Kim, it was the management. And more specifically, it was Steven, the hotel manager. Jerome scrolled down to the management reports, looking for Steven's involvement in the complaints. His name appeared on every page, too. But instead of taking action, he had done nothing. Steven had known about Kim's behavior and had done absolutely nothing to stop it. He had ignored the complaints, shrugged them off as if they were just part of the job. He hadn't reprimanded her, hadn't conducted an investigation, hadn't even bothered to follow up with the guests who had lodged the complaints. This wasn't just neglect. It was a failure of leadership. Jerome had built his empire on a commitment to excellence, and here, at the heart of it, was a manager who couldn't be bothered to protect the reputation of the hotel. Jerome clenched his jaw as he read through Steven's responses in the logs. Each one was a weak excuse. "I'll talk to Kim about it," he'd written, as if a simple conversation would fix the problem. But it was clear that Steven wasn't addressing the root cause. He wasn't taking responsibility for the hotel's standards, and worse, he was allowing this behavior to continue unchecked. Jerome's mind raced as he processed everything. He had always known that leadership was about more than just managing operations. It was about setting the tone, creating a culture where every guest was treated with respect, and every employee held to the highest standards. Kim's behavior was a direct result of Steven's failure to lead. It was clear now, he was part of the problem. To it, he looked back at Kim, who was now visibly sweating, her hands shaking as she stood behind the desk. She was cornered. There was no escape for her now. And there was no escape for Steven either. "Kim," Jerome said, his voice low and controlled, but there was no mistaking the weight of his words. "You are not just a bad employee, you are a liability. To the hotel, to the brand, and to the guests who come here expecting the best." Kim opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. She was trapped. She knew it. Jerome wasn't just going to let her slide. He wasn't going to let her get away with it. "You've been allowed to act like this for far too long," he continued, his eyes hardening. "And the only reason you've been allowed to get away with it is because of a manager who doesn't care enough to do his job." Kim's face drained of color. She had no defense. Jerome could see the panic building in her eyes, the realization dawning that everything was coming crashing down on her. "And as for you," Jerome turned to face the manager's report on his phone, his finger tapping the screen once more. "Steven, you've been warned, and yet you did nothing. You're as guilty as she is. You've failed as a leader, and now you will be held accountable for it." Kim trembled, her eyes flicking between Jerome and the screen of his phone, where the damning evidence of her actions was laid bare. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words never came. Jerome knew that he couldn't fix this with just one firing, one decision. This was bigger than Kim. This was a failure of leadership, a failure of the culture he had worked so hard to build. And he wasn't done yet. He straightened up, his mind already working on the next steps. There were things that needed to be fixed. People needed to be held accountable. And this hotel, this empire, needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. Jerome's hands trembled slightly, but his resolve remained unshaken. The room around him felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on him with each passing second. Kim was cornered, but it wasn't just her actions that disturbed him. It was the failure of leadership that allowed this situation to spiral out of control. And now he was going to fix it. Jerome stood tall, his gaze hardening as he looked from Kim to the reports on his phone. The anger that had been building in him since he'd stepped into the hotel was now searing through his veins. This wasn't just about a single employee's misconduct. It was about a deeper issue, one that had festered for far too long under Steven's complacent watch. "You've caused enough damage here," Jerome said, his voice low and controlled, but carrying an undeniable weight. And it ends today. Kim stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing as if she wanted to say something, anything, to justify her actions. But there was nothing she could say that would undo what she had done. There was no excuse, no way to explain away the racist comments, the dismissive attitude, and the repeated failure to provide even the bare minimum of hospitality. Stephen? Jerome turned to face the manager's office. He was calm, but every word he spoke sent a tremor through the room. Get in here, now. The words were sharp, commanding, and they had the desired effect. Stephen's face paled as he hurried from his office, his eyes flicking nervously between Jerome and Kim. The tension in the air was so thick that it was almost palpable. Guests in the lobby had started to take notice, their whispered conversations dying down as they watched the unfolding drama. Some had stopped what they were doing, their eyes shifting toward the front desk, curious but hesitant. They had no idea what was about to happen. Stephen entered the lobby, his steps hesitant, his usually smooth demeanor now shattered by the confrontation. "Mr. Wilson, I don't," Jerome interrupted, his voice cutting through Stephen's words like a knife. "You've had every opportunity to address this. You've known about Kim's behavior for months, and you did nothing. You've ignored the complaints, you've let her drag this hotel's reputation through the mud. And now I'm here to clean up the mess." Stephen flinched, but Jerome wasn't done. The sense of betrayal in his chest was burning, and he wasn't going to let Stephen escape this moment. "You failed as a manager. You've allowed this place to become a breeding ground for disrespect. And for that, you're going to fix it. Right now." He turned back to Kim, who was still standing behind the desk, her hands trembling. She had been quiet now, realizing that no amount of excuses or apologies would save her. Jerome didn't even let her try to explain herself. She had made her choices, and now there were consequences. "Kim," Jerome's voice rang out, cold and unwavering. "You're fired. Effective immediately." Kim's eyes widened, her face going pale as the words sank in. She took a step back, as if she hadn't quite understood what was happening. "Wait, what?" she stammered, her voice rising in panic. "No, please. This is all just a misunderstanding. I didn't mean—" "No," Jerome interrupted her firmly, stepping forward. His voice was still steady, but the power behind his words was undeniable. "You didn't make a mistake, Kim. You made a choice. You decided to disrespect the guests, to treat them like they were beneath you, and worst of all, you did it repeatedly. I've seen your record, the complaints, the behavior. You don't belong in this hotel, and I'm not going to let you continue to damage the reputation of this brand." Kim opened her mouth again, but no words came out. She looked around at the guests, who were now watching with wide eyes, some of them whispering to each other. It was clear that Jerome's words had cut deep. Kim's arrogance, the same arrogance that had allowed her to treat guests like garbage, was now crumbling in the face of real accountability. But Jerome didn't feel sorry for her. He wasn't there to save her. "Take your things," he said coldly, "and leave, now." Kim stood frozen, unable to form a coherent sentence. She turned slowly, looking over her shoulder toward Stephen, hoping for some kind of support, some kind of intervention. But Stephen stood there, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. He wasn't going to stop this. He knew he couldn't. Kim was on her own now. The silence was deafening as Kim gathered her things, the clattering of her bag against the desk echoing through the lobby. The guests watched in stunned silence, unsure of what to make of the situation. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed relieved. Jerome didn't care. This was necessary. This was justice. When Kim finally walked past him, her face twisted in anger and humiliation, Jerome didn't flinch. He had made the right call, and the hotel was better off without her. "Stephen," Jerome turned to the manager, his eyes narrowing. "You're not off the hook yet. You're going to do a full audit of this hotel starting right now. I want every single guest complaint reviewed, every incident logged, and I want a full report by the end of the day. And you're going to make sure something like this never happens again. If you can't handle that, Stephen," Then you're next. Stephen swallowed hard, his face paling even further. I'll take care of it, Mr. Wilson. I swear. Good, Jerome said, his voice like ice. Because if you fail, I'll handle it myself. You've had your chance. Now it's time for you to step up or step out. As Kim disappeared through the front doors, Jerome turned back to the front desk, where the remaining staff were still frozen in place, eyes wide. He let the silence hang for a moment before he spoke again. "This hotel is going to be better," he said, his voice now calm but filled with resolve. "And it starts today. From this moment forward, you're all going to treat every guest with the respect they deserve. If you can't do that, you won't be here. Understood?" The staff nodded quietly, some looking nervous, others ashamed. Jerome nodded in return, his gaze hardening as he turned toward the elevator. He had made his decision. The cleanup had begun, and he wasn't going to stop until this hotel, this empire, was running the way it was meant to. Flawlessly, that as Jerome watched Kim exit through the hotel's glass doors, he felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with a deep sense of urgency. This was just the beginning. Firing one employee, no matter how deserving, wasn't enough. The culture that had allowed her behavior to fester for so long needed to be eradicated. And the only way to do that was to tear down the foundations of complacency and rebuild from the ground up. He strode across the lobby, his shoes clicking sharply against the marble, his mind already working through the next steps. There was a sense of finality in his actions, but the weight of responsibility pressed down on him. Jerome Wilson didn't just run a hotel empire. He ran a family of employees who were entrusted with the sacred task of caring for his guests. And somewhere along the way, that trust had been broken. "Stephen," Jerome's voice was like steel, the sound of his name making the manager flinch slightly. He had been standing, frozen, in the corner, watching the exchange in shock. But Jerome didn't care for his discomfort. This was about action, not feelings. "Get the finance team," Jerome ordered, his eyes hard and unwavering. "I want a full audit of all guest complaints. Every single one. I want to know who has been affected, who has been mistreated, and how we are going to make it right. No exceptions." Stephen nodded shakily, still not fully recovered from the shock of what had transpired. His voice trembled when he spoke. "Yes, Mr. Wilson, I'll get them on it right away." Jerome didn't wait for another word. He knew Stephen wouldn't hesitate now. The fear was clear in his eyes. There was nothing left to say. But Jerome wasn't done. Not by a long shot. That he turned to face the rest of the staff, who had been watching in stunned silence, unsure of how to process what had just unfolded. Jerome's voice rang out, louder now, his authority filling the room. "Listen up," he said, his gaze sweeping across them all. "This hotel is going through a complete overhaul. Every guest complaint is going to be addressed. Every one of you is going to be reevaluated. This culture of indifference and disrespect stops today." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. He could see the unease in their eyes. They knew things were changing, but what they didn't know was just how deep this transformation would go. "The first priority is our guests," Jerome continued, his tone now steady, almost calm, but with an undeniable edge. "I want a full refund and compensation for any guest who has been treated unfairly. Not just for the complaints from today, but for all past incidents. I want this hotel to be a place of trust, where our guests know we will always do the right thing by them." One of the staff members, a young woman named Sarah, took a step forward, her voice tentative. "Mr. Wilson, are you sure this is necessary? I mean, we've always done our best, And Jerome's eyes locked on hers, and she immediately fell silent. "Don't question me, Sarah," he said, his voice cold and firm. "The best is no longer good enough. I'm not asking for perfection. I'm demanding accountability. And if you can't deliver that, you won't have a job here." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. No one spoke, but every eye was on Jerome. They were all feeling the weight of his words, understanding the seriousness of the situation. "Get started on the compensation process immediately," Jerome ordered, his gaze sweeping over the group. "Don't come to me with excuses. Do what's right for the guests and do it now." Without waiting for another word, he turned to the side, pulling out his phone to make a few more calls. But there was something else on his mind, something even more pressing, that he made his way to the elevator, his steps purposeful, his resolve unwavering. Once inside, he tapped the button for the top floor, where the hotel's executive offices were located. It was time for a real change. The management system needed to be completely reworked. The leadership here had failed, and it wasn't just Stephen who had to go. It was the entire system that allowed employees like Kim to thrive. Jerome stepped off the elevator and walked into his office, which overlooked the entire hotel. The city sprawled beneath him, oblivious to the storm that had just begun. He sat down behind his desk, taking a moment to breathe. He could feel the weight of what he had to do next. This wasn't just about firing a few bad employees. It was about ensuring that this kind of behavior could never take root again. He grabbed the phone on his desk, dialing the number for his chief of operations. "I need a complete overhaul of our training system," he said when the line connected. "From now on, every employee, from front desk to management, will undergo rigorous customer service training. No more shortcuts, no more slack. I want people who care, people who are willing to uphold the values we've built this empire on." He paused for a moment, taking in the silence. This was the hard part, the part that would require him to lead by example, to make the changes necessary for long-term success. "Make it happen," he said, his voice resolute. "And while you're at it, get HR to start working on a better way to evaluate our managers. We need people who understand the importance of respect, of setting the tone for our employees. Stephen may have been a manager, but he's no leader." As he hung up the phone, Jerome leaned back in his chair, letting the reality of the situation settle in. The changes would be far-reaching. There would be pushback. Some people would resist. But Jerome wasn't afraid of that. This was his hotel, his empire. He would tear it down and rebuild it, stronger and more resilient than ever. And as the sun set behind the skyline, Jerome couldn't help but feel a small flicker of hope. This hotel, his hotel, was about to become a place where respect, professionalism, and integrity were the cornerstones of everything they did. And he was going to make sure of it. No matter what it took. Jerome's footsteps echoed through the hotel as he walked back toward the manager's office. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. He had just witnessed one of his most trusted employees, Kim, being fired on the spot for her unprofessional behavior. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. There was a bigger problem at the heart of this hotel. A failure in leadership that had allowed this culture of indifference and disrespect to spread unchecked. And the person responsible for that failure, Stephen. As Jerome approached the office, he could already feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had tried to give Stephen the benefit of the doubt. He had given him opportunities to make things right, to step up and lead. But Stephen had proven, without a shadow of a doubt, that he was incapable of managing this hotel. And now Jerome was done. He opened the door to Stephen's office without knocking. Stephen was seated behind his desk, his eyes wide, his hands trembling slightly as he shuffled papers on the desk in front of him. His usual air of confidence, the one he wore like a well-tailored suit, had completely evaporated. All that remained was a man who knew his job was slipping through his fingers like sand. "Mr. Wilson," Stephen said, his voice nervous, cracking with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. I was going to." Jerome held up a hand, silencing him before he could finish his sentence. There was no time for excuses, no room for more empty promises. Jerome had heard enough. "Stephen," he said, his voice steady, calm even, but there was a cutting edge to it. "You've had plenty of chances. Too many, in fact. And yet here we are. This hotel is a mess, and you've been standing by, letting it fall apart." Stephen shifted in his chair, his hands growing clammy. He opened his mouth to speak, but Jerome wasn't interested in hearing his excuses. "Not anymore. You've known about Kim's behavior for months," Jerome continued, his voice growing colder with each word. "You've received complaints, you've seen the reports, and you've done nothing. You've been more concerned with avoiding conflict than with actually running this hotel. That ends today." Stephen's face turned pale. The weight of Jerome's words hit him like a physical blow, and he felt his pulse race. He knew this was coming, but somehow, hearing it out loud made it feel so much worse. I thought I could handle it," Stephen stammered, his eyes darting between Jerome and the floor. "I was going to talk to her. I just needed more time. She's been a problem, but I thought—" "You thought wrong." Jerome cut him off, his eyes narrowing. "This is not about thinking or giving people second chances. This is about leadership, about taking responsibility. And you, Stephen, have failed in both areas." Stephen swallowed hard, the realization sinking in. He had failed. He had let this hotel, his team, and its reputation slide into chaos. And now, Jerome was standing in front of him, holding him accountable for it. "You're not a leader," Jerome said bluntly, his gaze unwavering. "You've been hiding behind your title, hoping things would sort themselves out. But they didn't. And now you're responsible for this mess." Stephen's face crumpled as the weight of the moment bore down on him. "Mr. Wilson, please, I can fix this. I can turn things around. Just give me a chance. Please." But Jerome was done. He wasn't going to waste another minute on someone who didn't understand what true leadership meant. He wasn't going to let Stephen's ineptitude cost him any more time, any more energy, or any more guests. "No," Jerome replied firmly, his tone final. "You've had your chance. You've failed. And now it's time for you to go." Stephen's heart sank as the words hit him like a ton of bricks. "What? No, Mr. Wilson, please. Don't do this. I can fix things. I can—" "You're fired, Stephen," Jerome said, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "Effective immediately." The room fell silent. Stephen's mouth opened, then closed. His mind raced, trying to come up with something, anything to salvage the situation. But nothing came. There was no way out of this. He had failed, and now he was paying the price. But I've been with the company for years," Stephen whispered, his voice cracking. "I've worked hard." Jerome's eyes were unyielding. "Years don't matter when you're incapable of doing your job. You've shown me nothing but excuses and incompetence. You're a liability, Stephen. And I won't allow you to drag this hotel down any further." Stephen stood there, rooted to the spot, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, frustration, disbelief. But Jerome didn't let up. "Pack your things and leave. Now," Jerome ordered. His voice was firm, unwavering. For a moment, Stephen just stared at him, as if he couldn't comprehend what was happening. The reality of it, the suddenness of his downfall, was too much to process. Jerome didn't wait for him to respond. He turned and walked toward the door, his back straight, his expression unreadable. He paused for a moment, just before stepping out of the office. He looked back over his shoulder, his voice calm but filled with a quiet authority. "If you have any self-respect left, you'll walk out of this hotel without making a scene," Jerome said, his words biting. "If you don't, I'll make sure everyone here knows exactly why you're being fired." Stephen stood frozen, the weight of Jerome's words crushing him. He felt like a man who had been betrayed by his own incompetence, his own failures. But it was too late. There was nothing left for him here. With a heavy heart, Stephen finally turned and began to gather his things. The realization that his career at this hotel was over settling in like a stone in his chest. Jerome stepped out of the office, his mind already focused on the next steps. The hotel needed change. Real change. And he wasn't going to stop until it was done right. That as Jerome walked out of the manager's office, he could feel a deep sense of satisfaction wash over him. But it was tinged with a profound understanding of the work still left to be done. The day's events had been a whirlwind of tough decisions, emotional confrontations, and significant change. But they were just the beginning of a long and necessary process of transformation. Jerome knew that to truly turn this hotel around, he would need to focus on more than just one bad employee or even one manager. He had to overhaul the entire operation. This hotel needed a new heart, a new soul, and a renewed commitment to excellence. The first step in this journey was already clear. He had to send a message that would echo through every hallway, every office, and every corner of this hotel. The message was simple. Mediocrity, arrogance, and poor service would no longer be tolerated. And most importantly, those who didn't align with the hotel's values would have to reconsider their roles. Jerome wasn't about to let the hotel he had built with so much care and dedication fall apart due to a few individuals who had lost sight of what truly mattered. As he walked back through the lobby, he saw the remaining staff, some still reeling from the shock of Kim's dismissal, others whispering quietly about the changes. Jerome knew that for this to work, he needed to ensure that every person in this building understood one fundamental truth. This was his hotel, and he had the final say in what kind of experience every guest would receive. He stopped for a moment, turning to face the group. The tension in the air was palpable, but so was the possibility for something better. They were at a crossroads, and it was up to him to guide them forward. "Listen up," Jerome said, his voice steady and firm. "You've all seen what happened today. I've made it clear that poor behavior, poor service, and unprofessionalism have no place here. But this isn't just about one person. This is about all of us. From now on, we are going to hold each other accountable. We're going to challenge each other to be better every single day." The staff listened intently, their eyes trained on him. Jerome's words hung in the air, and for the first time, they truly felt the weight of the responsibility they carried. It wasn't just about showing up to work anymore. It was about creating an environment where every guest felt respected, valued, and welcome. And that started with them. "I expect each of you to bring your best to this job," Jerome continued. "This hotel is not just a building, it's an experience. And every person who walks through those doors deserves the best we have to offer. If you're not ready to give your best, if you're not ready to contribute to the culture we're building here, then maybe it's time for you to reconsider your place in this hotel." The words were direct, but they weren't meant to intimidate, they were meant to inspire. Jerome was calling on them to rise to the occasion, to elevate their work ethic and their attitude, and to embrace the responsibility they had to uphold the hotel's legacy. "You are all a part of something bigger than yourself," he said, his tone softening slightly. "This isn't just about you or me. It's about creating an environment where we all thrive. But we can only do that if we work together, hold each other accountable, and constantly strive for excellence." Jerome paused for a moment, letting the weight of his message settle in. He saw the staff beginning to nod, some faces softening, others showing the first signs of understanding. It wasn't going to be an easy journey. There would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt, and growing pains. But Jerome knew that they had it in them. This team could turn this hotel into something even greater than it had been before. "We'll start with training," he continued. "Every one of you will undergo new customer service training. This will not be optional. If you want to stay in this hotel, you'll learn how to deliver the kind of service that sets us apart from every other place in town. We'll do more than just meet expectations. We'll exceed them." Jerome smiled as he watched their reactions. Some were nervous, but most were starting to feel the spark of excitement. They could see the vision now. This wasn't about punishment, it was about improvement. It was about giving them the tools they needed to succeed. And for the first time in a long while, they had someone who believed in them. Someone who was going to invest in their growth, in their potential. "But I'm not doing this alone," he added, his voice steady. "I'm relying on each of you to help create the kind of workplace where respect, professionalism, and a commitment to excellence aren't just encouraged, they're expected. We'll work together to build a team that is proud of what we do and how we do it." As the staff nodded and murmured their agreement, Jerome felt a sense of satisfaction settle in. This was just the beginning, but the foundation was being laid for something great. He had come into this hotel as an outsider, but now he was going to be the leader it needed. He was going to help this place find its soul again. "Let's get to work," Jerome said, his tone firm, but filled with hope. "There's a lot to be done, and it all starts now. We're going to fix this hotel, and we're going to make it better than ever." With that, Jerome turned and headed back toward his office. He could feel the weight of the future on his shoulders, but for the first time in a long while, he felt certain that this hotel was on the right path. If you enjoyed this story of leadership, transformation, and overcoming adversity, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more exciting and educational content. Every day is an opportunity to improve, to push forward, and to build something better together. Let's keep growing, learning, and evolving. Stay tuned, and remember, change starts with you.